a great pleasure to be here amongst such august company. I have to stand still though. Not used to that. One of the aims of historical research is to provide new perceptions and illuminating insights. The notion of convicts having a life which included music and dance is strikingly at odds with the prevailing popular image of convict heritage. I'm a dance historian and I've been involved in folk and historical dance all my life, and I've taught and performed many of the aspects of dance that belong to the Australian tradition. This covers the elite forms of historical dance such as Regency and Victorian ballroom, as well as classical ballet, and I have a grounding in the many forms of folk dance in Australia, so Irish and Scottish and English traditions. I've been studying elite colonial dance for over 3 decades, so the sort of dancing that occurred in these houses and at Government House. I know quite a lot about that, and it links in with the English country houses too. Over the last couple of years, I've shifted my focus from the privileged members of colonial society to the lower end, the convicts, covering the period from 1788 to 1840. From a number of sources, we're aware that popular culture had been established very early in the settlement, and we knew that dancing had been reported as one of the most popular of pastimes. However, very little was known about the details of the culture. When I began this research, I had no idea if I'd been able to find enough information to even begin the project, but I've been really amazed at how much I've been able to find and the depth of that information. So here's the story. First of all, I'll begin with just a little brief outline of social dance history, which Katrina's covered a little. If you were to search for history of dance before the 20th century, this is what you'll find. It's a beautiful picture about ballet. So the history of dance is primarily about the elite forms of dance. It's about ballet and court dance. There's very little about social dance, and even less written about social dance for ordinary people. Dance itself has not generally been regarded as a serious subject for research. In Cartesian dualism, which has been central to academic life, the brain is considered the seat of all intelligence, and the body really is just there to carry it around. At certain times, this has been heightened by people viewing the body as being the font of all types of sinful desires. And there's a lovely example of this in the Sydney Gazette in 1827, talking about the evils of unlicensed public houses. The youth of both sexes are attracted to these dens of destruction by the vivid excitation of animal spirits, which music and dancing and unrestrained mirth produces. So you can see it can be pretty dreadful activity. You want to be careful. The dance historian Ramsay Burt suggests that the other aspect which has caused the study of social dance to be viewed as undesirable has been the idea that lower class culture is crass and vulgar. And as most research was carried out by privileged middle class observers, dance for the working classes was simply not an area they wanted to explore. So, what do we know about social dance history? In attempting to work out how people danced in the early years of the colony here, the national dance form was the English country dance, and it was the most popular form of dancing starting from the late 16th century right up to the early 19th century. So obviously that was the case here too. It's significant to note when Graham was speaking, he listed the 3 pieces of music that were published in Australia, they were all dance. They were written for the dance, they were written for quadrilles and the waltz. So I think that just reflects how popular and important dance was. The other dance form which was popular throughout this time was the percussive dance form, which was commonly known as step dance. It's like the forerunner to tap dance. These were generally referred to as jigs and hornpipes, and they were regarded as completely inappropriate in the ballroom because they were noisy. So I began looking at dance for common people in Britain and Ireland during this period. And given that there's no literature about this, there's no modern literature about this, I had to spread the net quite broadly. So I searched the online resource, which claims to be the largest body of text dealing with the lives of non-elite people ever published, which is the Old Bailey Court Proceedings. Now, you may not think that there would be much about dance in the Old Bailey Court Proceedings, because you can't really steal dancing, but you can steal dancing shoes and you can steal from dancing masters, and there's a lot of other background material that comes through. Things like, I was at a dance in the tap room and I saw the prisoner dancing a reel. So there's a lot of sort of factual information given in the trial evidence, and it reveals a lot about when and where, and occasionally what people were dancing. Now, since I was looking at convict dance, I then looked in British prisons. Obviously, most prison records don't talk about dancing, but occasionally someone would write something about the conditions and the lifestyle there. And it turned out that dancing did occur in prisons. They changed enormously during the period under the study. So from 1788, they were very different from 1840, but they were still places where people did drink and sing and dance. So I have a rare drawing of somebody dancing in a prison. So that's a rare find. It comes from Charles Dickens' first novel, and his father had been in the debtor's prison, so he had first-hand experience of what occurred there. I was also surprised to find a description of dancing on the hulks. The hulks were the prison ships that were moored in the Thames and in the coastal towns in England and Ireland. They had the reputation of being the worst types of prisons, yet there's still accounts of people dancing there. Several convicts interviewed during a commission in 1823 stated that in the evenings they'd been locked in for the night and it was a regular practice to dance. On one hulk they even had a clarinet. They had 2 fiddles and a bass and a clarinet, which I thought was really interesting. On the ships bringing the convicts to Australia, it seems to have become common practice for the surgeons who supervise the well-being of the convicts to encourage dancing as a regular activity. One of these surgeons, Peter Cunningham, wrote about convicts dancing to the music of their jangling chains. So next we come to the key subject, dancing in the colony. So here we have William Bradley's remarkable painting of members of the First Fleet dancing with the Indigenous people. There's a little more detail. So it shows the Marines and the sailors dancing. But we know from the early accounts that the convicts also danced regularly with the local people who lived around the harbour. For those of us with an interest in convict history, we'll be aware that the image of convicts leading terrible, debased lives has been replaced by a more balanced view, as suggested by the historian Grace Karskens. She wrote, "It's now understood that the majority of convicts live quite normal lives, and many were much better off than they would have been if they'd remained in Britain. Most convicts did not live in prisons and were not shackled or flogged. They were fed and clothed, their working day finished at 3 in the afternoon, allowing them time to themselves for work, leisure, and they could choose where they lived." Both Grace Karskens and Robert Jordan state that tavern culture was established very early in the settlement, and it's believed that it was really a culture of rebellion. The French officer Louis Freycinet, visiting the colony in 1819, remarked on the excessive leisure time enjoyed by the convicts, and Commissioner Bigg, who came to report on the colony in the 1820s, complained about the high number of public houses where dancing and fiddling took place. But dancing wasn't confined just to public houses. It was part of everyday life, as well as at celebrations such as weddings and fairs, and even wakes. The main source of information about convict dancing in the colony comes from the police reports in the local papers. Although dancing itself wasn't illegal, many of the circumstances surrounding it were, and these were reported. Houses where drinking, fiddling and dancing took place were required to be licensed. Otherwise, they earned the title of disorderly houses. There are also curfews in place, and convicts who were out after hours without permission were in trouble too, especially if they were dancing. So there's a large body of information gathered from this source. Dancing was reported in the Hyde Park convict barracks in Sydney, the female factories in Sydney and Hobart, and the convict theatres at Emu Plains and Norfolk Island. Gender doesn't seem to have been a factor in dances, as men would dance together in the absence of women and vice versa. So that often happened in convict ships and establishments. This leads us to the first newspaper in the colony, the Sydney Gazette. When we read this paper, it's obviously written to entertain the readers, rather than supply factual evidence for dance historians. So many of the accounts are highly amusing. This is one of my favourites. A trio of the most amiable description were charged with glee singing in George Street. A constable, amazed at this course of proceeding, stepped up and wished to know what they were at, when they joined hands and danced in a circle around him. Irritated at this, he surrounded them and conveyed them to the lockup. Later, they to the stocks took their lonely way, there to repose and enjoy the healthful breezes and glorious sunshine for 1 hour each. Isn't that great? So the humour in many of the cases makes the identification of actual dancers difficult, as sometimes they use dance as a metaphor, and at other times they seem to have grabbed hold of any fanciful dance that comes to mind, such as fandangos and sarabands, which they may have danced, but it's clear that the country dances, reels and step dances, were the forms preferred by the convicts. By the 1830s, the more modern styles of dancing, the quadrille and waltz, began to be reported in lower order gatherings, with the fashion turning away from the country dances. Having established that dancing was definitely flourishing in the colony, I then looked at the way dances were transmitted. It's getting breezy. Other than the major factor of people picking up dances by immersion, dancing masters were the main way that people learnt to dance. They generally came from within their own class, so gentlemanly dancing masters taught the upper classes, and lower order dancing masters taught within their own ranks. Those at the top of the scale were the teachers who described themselves as professors of dancing. These were the ones who taught dancing to the genteel ladies and gentlemen. And for these privileged classes, dancing was important as a way to show you were properly educated. You had both the time and the money to spend on dancing lessons to acquire the graces essential for the upper classes. So how to move with elegance and poise and dignity. The fellow in this picture obviously didn't learn this as a child, and he's awkwardly struggling to pick up the qualities as an adult. This was a problem that apparently faced a number of upwardly mobile, emancipated convicts in the colony, if we can judge by the advertisements. Not all convicts came from the lower orders, and there was a smattering of political and genteel people amongst them, which is why we have a range of dancing masters in the colony who were convicts. There were several who arrived as convicts. For example, Francois Girard and Charles Manuel Green. Both had been officers in Napoleon's army, and this gave them the advantage of being recognised immediately as gentlemen, and they seem to have done quite well for themselves teaching dancing here. At the other end of the scale were the lower order dancing masters, or hop merchants, as they are sometimes called. I've been able to identify a number of these types who came to the colony, though it's difficult to ascertain whether they continued in the profession because they didn't advertise. It was just a word of mouth thing where people would see them dancing and attend their classes. So the only manuscript of convict music I've been able to locate comes from Alexander Lang. He was a talented Scottish fiddler who came to the colony in 1812, and he was sent to Tasmania. A photocopy of his manuscript dated from 1863 is in the Tasmanian archives. Otherwise, I found a number of accounts in the local papers. So the two top tunes that have come about have been Jigs, Paddy Carey, and Off She Goes. So if anyone knows any other convict music, I would be very pleased to hear from you. Music was generally provided by the fiddle, with some accounts listing flutes, barrel organs, fifes and drums. And from Norfolk Island, we have the convict-made whistle and part of a harmonica. And from the Hyde Park Barracks here, we have a Jew's harp. You found quite a few of those, didn't you, Antigua? I believe. 2 or 3, I think. Yeah. 3. Interesting, 3. Yes. So another aspect I've used in exploring lower order dance is to look at the art of the period. So there's no images of convicts dancing in the colony, so I've drawn upon British sources. This is probably the most unflattering image of dancing that I have in my collection. I've chosen it as an example of the way that the lower orders could be viewed by the upper class observers. They were often portrayed as having coarse features and behaving in a very ungainly manner. They've obviously had a bit of a tipple as well, haven't they? So there are a lot of caricatures from this period of lower order dancing. There's artists such as George Cruikshank and James Gilroy and Thomas Rowlandson, and they like to capture everyday life, particularly in London. So we have quite a fascinating legacy, despite the fact that they're obviously not accurate depictions of dancing. They do provide quite a lot of information. So this picture, which is clearly a caricature, shows 4 people dancing a reel. You can see, well, I can see that there's 4 of them in a line and they're dancing setting steps quite energetically as well, which wasn't something that genteel people did. We don't think they danced energetically. So, to summarise, it's clearly evident that dance was highly significant as an element in social life in the colony, both for the upper classes and the convicts. Over the last 2 years, I've been gathering information about convict dance and constructing a database. And this year, I'm using this data to conduct a series of workshops and examine the dances. This isn't so easy because people just don't have the cultural capital that we need to sort of authentically reconstruct them. But it will give us an image of how they may have looked. So the plan is ultimately to have the database and videos of the dances freely available, so I'll probably put them on my existing website. And next year there's plans underway to have an interactive exhibition in the Redcliffe Museum in Brisbane, which is where I live. And Redcliffe is where the first settlement happened in Brisbane. So it's on the museum is actually on the site of that setting. So I hope this aspect of convict life will become recognised as one of the few aspects of lives which we can actually experience ourselves, and will provide a completely different perspective on convict life in the early colony. Thank you.